Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's NeoSystems CMMC Town Hall. Now I'd like to introduce your host, Ed Bassett from NeoSystems. Ed?
Thanks, Don, and welcome everyone to our continuing series of Town Hall Ask Me Anything sessions on the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. Today we're going to deviate a little bit from the CMMC focus with our guest, Mark Montgomery from the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. I want to mention to the audience that we are recording these sessions as part of our community outreach to the defense industrial base. Our focus at NeoSystems as a managed service provider is primarily on organizations that are seeking certification under CMMC. So that's mostly who we have in the audience here today. I do want to encourage audience members, if you have some questions for Mark during the next 30 minutes, please send those in on the Q&A feature within Zoom, and I will try to work some of those questions in if time permits. I'll start with an introduction of our guest, Mark Montgomery. Mark serves as the Senior Director of the Center on Cyber and Technology Innovation at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, or FDD, where he leads their efforts to advance U.S. prosperity and security through technology innovation while countering cyber threats that seek to diminish them. Mark served as the Executive Director of the congressionally mandated Cyberspace Solarium Commission, where he remains a Senior Advisor. Previously, he served as Policy Director for the Senate Armed Services Committee under the leadership of Senator John McCain, coordinating policy efforts on national security strategy, capabilities and requirements, and cyber policy. Prior to that, Mark served for 32 years in the U.S. Navy as a nuclear-trained surface warfare officer, retiring as a Rear Admiral in 2017. Mark, thank you very much for your service, and thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Ed. It's a real pleasure to be here again.
So with the Cyberspace Solarium Commission and subsequent to that, Mark, you've been really involved in strategic policy around this overall cybersecurity posture of our nation. So today, as I mentioned, we're going to expand our view beyond the DIB, the defense industrial base, beyond our usual topic of CMMC, to look at the bigger picture of layered cyber deterrence. I'll start with what I think is the big news of the week: the nomination of Chris Inglis as the first National Cyber Director. New position. This was created really in fulfillment of one of the key recommendations of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission report. So this has to be, I would think, a pretty big moment for you, having championed that. Please put that in perspective for us. What's the impact of the National Cyber Director position and the appointment of Chris to that?
Well, first, I think it's a big deal. The commission certainly prioritized the National Cyber Director. I think it's a good thing to get that kind of strategic leadership into the White House. And I think Chris Inglis is a terrific first National Cyber Director, or nominee to be first National Cyber Director. I think he brings some very unique skill sets. He has both the government background with nearly 3 decades at NSA, but really the last 6-7 years, he's been working with the private sector and on boards and in other capacities and really has a great, I saw during 2 years of his work on the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, a real understanding of how to build what's necessary for a public-private collaboration, where the gaps are, and what we probably need to do to fix it. He's also got the bureaucratic expertise. He's about to do something which is 2 words: startup and U.S. government, and those 2 words should never be used in the same sentence. And he's going to take on a very large one. Standing up a federal commission like my staff and I did 2 years ago was a very small version of that. And I have to tell you, it was one of the most demanding bureaucratic challenges I ever dealt with. So conceptually, for him doing this inside the White House, it's going to be quite a challenge. I think he's got the right chops for that. But then most importantly, he's got a great relationship with the other senior leader, Ann Neuberger, at the National Security Council. She's off to a great start, doing really good work. She's doing things that both the National Security Council should do and the National Cyber Director should do, because there isn't an NCD. But I think the 2 of them, they have a pre-existing relationship. They're both skilled. I'm excited about that opportunity, and where this doesn't mean bad things won't happen. But I do think the federal government is going to organize itself in a way that over the past 22 years, since we first pushed this forward in PDD 63 and the Marsh Commission and the first National Information Assurance Plan back in 2000, what was envisioned then hasn't happened. And I really think this is the first good opportunity to really tackle it with that team. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Jen Easterly going to CISA is great. Rob Silver's going to the Undersecretary of Defense for Policies. It's unusual to have a cyber person in that job, but that's fantastic for for the cyber enterprise. And so I really think this is a great team being organized. Doesn't guarantee success, but a poor team does guarantee failure.
The NCD position, I mean, that gets cyber inside the White House, reporting directly to the president, yes?
It sure does, and it gets it inside the final budget decision-making process. It gets it inside the initial incident response process. It gets it inside the campaign planning process. All the key things that really have to be. There are some top-down things. Direction to fund cybersecurity at a certain level is a top-down thing. It has not happened. As a result, with 108 federal agencies and departments out there, the vast majority of them do not see cybersecurity as a top 1, 2, or 3 priority, with the exception of CISA, maybe NSA, cybercom as an element of the military. The vast majority, cybersecurity falls down the prioritization list as the budget decisions get harder and harder, and in the end is often on the chopping floor. You need someone at the White House to say that is not a decision the president supports, and we need to get cybersecurity back into the budget, and we need to find the offset. And then same with campaign planning. We have way too many stovepiped efforts in law enforcement and at Homeland, at Defense. These have to be brought together in the intelligence community. These have to be brought together under one leader in the White House to kind of lead that pre-planning, that coordination. When we looked back at what happened during the COVID response, it was that lack of pre-preparation and planning and the building of the relationships with the state and local governments and the private sector that was kind of missing. It had been there on and off over 20 years in the White House, but it was missing at the time of COVID. As a response, it was unlikely that we were going to be successful in January, February, and March of 2020. And not surprisingly, we weren't. And so we kind of think for these non-traditional national security emergencies, the National Security Advisor benefits greatly from having someone else who's focused on this on a day-to-day basis.
Very cool. Also, in that same mix, we've seen CISA funding being bolstered up. Is that an expansion of CISA mission? And what do you see as kind of top priorities for some of that new funding?
So there's two aspects to CISA funding. First, I think fundamentally they've been under-resourced. And look, I don't blame anybody for that. It's a new agency starting up. It was taking things from other places. It was unlikely it was going to be overly resourced. The best prospect was probably that it would be properly resourced. I think it was generally under-resourced. So part of it's closing that gap. Part of it's also new mission in the National Defense Authorization Act that set up the NCD. There was also a significant amount of new authorities given and responsibilities given to CISA. And there's one other kind of unspoken one. They were asked to do an assessment of their personnel. We used the military terminology, a force structure assessment of their personnel. Do you have the right people? Do you have the right number of people? Do you have the right technology? Do you have the right infrastructure? The answer to all 4 of those questions is going to be no. So when they come back, there's going to be a bill associated with that force structure assessment. So what they've gotten is $650 million in the ARPA, the COVID bill. That money went broadly to improving their incident response. And it was all about the federal network IT. It had nothing to do with CISA's building a public-private partnership role, but it was about improving their incident response capability, improving their analytical capability, and then under their kind of their pass-through funding to other federal agencies, their ability to provide more continuous diagnostic monitoring program support, more cloud security support. So that money is flowing to that. That really doesn't solve those gaps I mentioned earlier in CISA. The skinny budget that came out, so here's another set of money, gave them $110 million increase, about 5%. Fully support 5%, but I would also say I'd fully support 15 to 20% as the right number. In general, non-DoD federal agencies had a 16% increase in budget. The president said very clearly, cybersecurity is a priority. A priority shouldn't get 5%, it should get between 15 and 20%. They could easily spend that effectively on the other half of their mission, building, meeting their mission and their new missions and their existing gaps in building a better public-private collaboration.
I think that public-private piece is definitely very key. What else can we expect from the new administration? One of the audience members wrote in, today Bloomberg reported that the Biden administration will be releasing a 100-day action plan to increase grid security, presumably electric grid. I haven't read that yet. Any insight into what will be in there, or other things that we may see coming out of the Biden administration in the space?
So we've done some conversations with them on the new executive orders, and certainly some of our commissioners have been called in to be more deeply involved, and there's been briefings. I'd say generally where they're headed, the executive orders they're developing all are based on what I would consider sound initial steps. Probably every timeline I've seen is faster than I think is realistic, but that is absolutely common in government documents, and congressional ones too. I wouldn't let it's not just an executive branch alone. But I'm excited to see these executive orders come out. I think that they'll begin to show how, Ann Neuberger and her team, the National Security Council, feel that, how do we begin to secure the federal IT networks better? And then how do we begin to secure the critical infrastructures in a more effective way? I think as an NCD comes out, both of those issues are probably ones that the NCD would champion, but they have to get off the ground now. So there is no national cyber director. There is no national cyber director office. So these executive orders are the best means for doing that. I think they'll get us in the right spot. I do worry, some of the executive orders I've seen on the grid for the previous administration, even some initially, some of the supply chain issues in this one, they tend to be like extremely focused on an aspect and don't stand back and give you the strategic picture. I'm hoping the front end of this executive order, these executive orders kind of explain, here's the strategic picture. Here's the lines of efforts we're working at. Very specifically, we want to tackle this right now because it's the highest priority. And I think if they take that approach, they're going to be in good shape. And I know they've been working with the private sector in developing these. So I'm optimistic.
So speaking of priorities, we've had a couple of really high profile state sponsored attacks, SolarWinds, some really advanced exploitation of Microsoft Exchange vulnerabilities. Do those events change anything, or do they just validate the urgency of taking action on deterrence? So
both. I think it's a good question. They do validate what probably, if there's 100 participants on there, 90 of the people on here knew to be true, as well as all, both of us, that we were at a significant risk. Over time, the increasing availability of tools to actors, malicious cyber tools to actors, has increased exponentially. The interconnectivity of our systems has increased exponentially. Our investment in cyber defenses has been linear, kind of on a low glide slope. When your risk drivers are exponential and your risk mitigators linear, you got a lot of risk. And so I think most of us saw this, and I think this has been demonstrated by both these events. But people knew that. Now, what's changed is I don't believe the $650 million for CISA, the $1 billion for the Tech Modernization Fund would have been in the ARPA legislation, the COVID legislation, if it weren't for SolarWinds and Microsoft Exchange. Okay. I just think for sure that's a good chunk of change. The Tech Modernization Fund, it's interesting. I've watched this over the last 2 years. It's been in existence for about 3.5 years. It's had 175 million appropriated to it. From what I can tell, it's expended about 87 to 90 million. It's envisioned originally at the end of the Obama administration was a $3 billion fund, a revolving fund, and you could take money out as a federal agency and you'd have to pay it back 5 years later, on a no interest 5-year loan, right? The idea was to incentivize, making those investments in cybersecurity. I don't think it was achieving its purpose. I'm hoping that in addition to putting that $1 billion in, they come back to us with new language that allows the board that runs it to maybe write off some of the, loan as grant. Then you'll get the service, the agencies bellying up very quickly. And I really worry about the small ones. When you have 108 federal departments and agencies, there's 25 or so that I would consider medium or big, and the other, 83 are small, and they 80 or so are small. And those ones, it's extremely hard to really focus an investment in cybersecurity. And as you know, a technology modernization is still only going to be about 10 to 12% security. You know, the vast majority of a tech modernization is going to be the procurement of the technology itself.
So one of the recommendations in the Solarium Commission report was certification and labeling of IT products. So, I mean, I think as we look at SolarWinds, we have kind of taken for granted that we can buy these products and use them in some trustworthy way. That's been shaken, right, a little bit, or maybe a lot by this event. So does that certification and labeling, is that at the center of kind of getting trust back in the software tools? And is it in the works? What else do you see as being part of that equation of how do we trust those things that we rely on every day?
So yeah, the National Cybersecurity Certification and Labeling Authorities is a provision we'll be trying to push again this year. We didn't get it through last year. I do think that was more of the part of the, hey, we have enough. You know, I don't think there was a specific negative feeling towards it, although I know there's concerns about it. So as we push for it this year, look, I'm sure I'll say this inappropriately at some point, but I should not say that it would have prevented SolarWinds, right? I don't think that's a fair statement. What I would say is I think it's part of the broader raising of the security of the overall cyber ecosystem. It'll make it easier for both small, particularly I think, people in small and medium-sized businesses to know that the software they're purchasing has the right quality of security embedded in it. Very hard to tell from the packaging, you know. But if you had a third party certifying that this meets a NIST frame, you know, a certain standard that the Commerce Department, you know, gives to the, say, an NGO that runs this, and then the NGO is out there doing these assessments and providing the certification or providing the vehicle for assessments and the certification, I really think that could help. I think the other group it helps is probably the cyber insurance market, as you begin to have tangible things that you can drive insurance rates on. Kind of like, does your car have a seatbelt? Used to be part of your insurance rate. Now it's baked in, since we don't build cars without seatbelts. Same with airbags, you know, same with fire, you know, smoke detectors and radon detectors in your house, and soon with security systems. These kind of improvements to security in the insurance field are used initially to bring everyone, to incentivize everyone to get to a certain standard, then eventually they become baked in. You know, I'm pretty sure if you have a fire in your house and you don't have a UL receptacle, you know, you're going to be in trouble. You're going to find out that you were not in adherence with your insurance policy. My point on this is I think it's part of the broader cyber ecosystem. So I try not to think too much about the software supply chain issue that's at the core of SolarWinds.
I think, yeah, that, you know, raising the bar. I mean, certainly this audience has been, we've been working on CMMC for the past year and a half, and the effort there is to really sort of harden the supply chain. But, you know, Microsoft estimated that there were 1,000 people potentially on the attack team behind the SolarWinds attack. That's a formidable attacks group there, right? 1,000 people, very likely to succeed against even a, you know, really well-defended target. So how do we raise the bar enough that we're effective against that sort of threat, or don't we? Is it more about response?
So first, it'll be hard. And yeah, you're very wise there to characterize this as you know, this was an espionage event. This was not a cyber attack in the same way, and that matters. It matters in how we respond. It doesn't matter in how you defend, though. And the idea is you do have to build better defenses. Look, do I think the .mil needs to be good enough to repel that sort of a, you know, concerted effort by, I think 1,000's a lot. I mean, that's a lot of APTs strung together. You know, but should they be able to do that? Yes. Should a company be able to do that? Even a large American company? No. And should, you know, Jim's dry cleaner down the street be able to take it? Of course not. Your PII data there is gone, you know, if an APT decides to target that. So there's different levels of security that are expected. But I would say at the very high end, and especially inside the military and the intelligence community, there is an expectation. What I do think is there needs to be an ability to detect anomalous activity. And that needs to be much more ubiquitous throughout both our federal and our national critical functions in the private sector. In other words, I expect Dominion Power to be able to do that, not Joe's Dry Cleaner, right? And even if he's in a low end cloud, he should not be required, be paying for that kind of security in a managed service provider. But I do expect the critical functions to be able to do that, and so I think that's an important inflection point for investment. It's going to cost a lot of money to buy that kind of anomalous activity detection, and to be able to detect burst transmissions and such out of your systems, and that kind of investment is necessary. And that was one of the key for layered cyber deterrence to work. The first thing is we actually had to have defensive systems that are functioning, and then we had to have an effective public-private collaboration to enable the sharing of information between the federal government and the private sector.
And yeah, I mean, detection is you think about it, SolarWinds, right? Detection was detected by FireEye. Essentially, they're the first people to really notice and figure out what was going on. But I would say they're at the very forefront of ability to detect anything, right? I mean, they're in that business. So I mean, they're probably better equipped to detect than, essentially any other company, to save a handful. So getting that kind of detection capability spread out, more broadly certainly would help, right?
Yeah, but I would say there's a cost to that, right? I mean, I have no idea. I don't I've never worked for any of those companies, but they provide a quality product and it comes at a price. What I would say is, I think the really large companies need to have that kind of protection. And then the kind of small and mediums and the smaller municipalities, we haven't mentioned them as much, state and locals, but the smaller municipalities need to find a way to get inside a managed service provider that provides that security. Here's the problem: security costs money. Small, medium, and particularly small businesses and municipalities, to a great degree, that money is an issue, and that if the discretionary issue on the cost, in other words, the cost driver between two programs is security, I think they'll often pick the lower cost, lower security software package, and I'm concerned that that unless we can focus people and get them to understand the actual threat that we're seeing today, that we're not going to improve that defense and raise that overall level of security in the cyber ecosystem.
So I've heard you talk before about involving the entire country in this effort, right? And really making it kind of a whole of nation thing. So, some of the things that the Defense Department's doing now with the DIB to try to raise the bar there, yeah. How do we take that kind of maybe that concept or a different concept and spread this out? You mentioned like underwriters' laboratories, like everybody's got underwriter laboratory stuck on all their receptacles all over their house, and it's kind of baked into how we build houses now. And seatbelts you mentioned. So is that, I guess, how do we cause that to happen so that the security just becomes something that is automatic for people when they buy stuff, it comes that way?
So a couple things. First, I think there's, for all cybersecurity, there's three legs to the stool, technology, people, and processes. So first of all, for the technology, that's the certification labeling authority. That's the identification of appropriate software to use. For the processes, it's about getting out good business cyber hygiene, getting an understanding of how am I supposed to treat DNSSEC? How do I do my domain registration? How do I do my how do I approach DMARC? Do I make the right security decisions at the kind of IT administrator level? And how do I report? How do I log? I was surprised that the federal government logging was fairly inconsistent. But how do I do the processes? And then finally, the people. And in some ways, the least expensive and most effective investment, but it takes persistence to train people. There's a personal cyber hygiene, the multi-factor authentication, complex password, don't answer emails from Nigerian princes, that kind of personal cyber hygiene. But then there's as I said, the hygiene that someone has to do as an employee within a company to make the decisions that the IT administrator has done effective. If you can bring that together, you'll be in good shape. One thing we are pushing hard, and it's a really long-term solution, is the education aspect of this. And I've given up on like educating, my parents, right? That's not going to happen in cyber. But I haven't given up on my kids who are still in high school, right? And the idea there is so we've been pushing hard for a program inside DHS called CTAP, where we literally train high school teachers on cyber security, cyber hygiene, so they can train their students. The only problem we have is that it's a good program, but it's not hitting, it's only hitting 10 to 15% of the of middle school and high school kids in their time flowing through the process. So we got to put more money into that. And look, at some core level, that kind of investment is going to raise the cybersecurity, the security of the cyber ecosystem over time. But those kind of long-term ones, we can't forget them while we kind of like all do the kids soccer thing around the expensive new technology problem. Zero trust. And everyone runs to the ball. Over here, this kind of education, it's like the tortoise and the hare. That tortoise is probably going to win the race for you, but it's a 10-year investment stream.
You're making me feel like an 8-year-old playing soccer. Thank you. The Solarium Commission, one of the things that the report emphasized was speed and agility, right? Mentioned many times in there, speed and agility. And I think jumping back to your earlier comment about information sharing, it seems like, all-way information sharing, public, private, within government, within industry, that's really critical to that. What do you see coming in terms of how we improve that? The government is center of some of those partnerships, initiating them, but I think there has to be really widespread industry involvement as well. So what are you thinking there in terms of fast flow of information?
Well, first, this is an area where the DIB will lead the way, because I think the DoD and the DIB are a couple steps ahead of the rest of the government, and that's good. But the rest of the government needs to catch up. Turns out that DoD is pretty reliant on Dominion Power, and pretty reliant on Southern Power, Southern Company, and pretty reliant on El Paso Natural Gas, companies that aren't necessarily the DIB. We got to get everybody going. So we do have some provisions in this year's that we're working in this year's legislative cycle. I don't know that there'll be an NDA necessarily. It could be another legislative vehicle. We call it the joint collaborative environment, but it's about saying to the federal government, you have to choose, you have to direct federal agencies to participate. First, get all the federal data flowing. Second, this is intrusions, unusual, suspicious behavior, unusual threat signals, and begin to pull in the private sector and the state and local. We've got to be sharing this data, and then at some level above it, have an analytical research going on at the more classified level with our expertise, working in a bilateral way with private sector companies when we see something very unusual or something targeting a critical function. But you've got to build this. The Brits have done it. Now they have a much smaller scale than us to build it on, and they have different rules about how they share data. They, as we like to say, they have the Magna Carta. We have the Constitution. I like the Constitution; gives me a lot more protects a lot more of my personal rights. But what it does kind of slow down that that development of information sharing in the government. So we do have to work on that. That's a key one in this year. And I think the center, that's CISA, they're the executive agent. But I think that the military and the intelligence community play a critical role in this because they have a lot of the expertise that would look at some of this analytic things. So we have to get that rule set right under CISA's authority that we're doing this. But we've got to improve this. In 2008, the federal agencies were directed to kind of like make all your kind of cyber information centers interoperable. And 9 years later, that is not where we are. It is more likely than not that information is shared through either Outlook through an email or shared through an LNO, like a hostage swap. My hostage is your place, and he's reporting back to me every day what you're seeing. We need something better than that. And look, there's some I don't want to make it sound like there's no interoperability. There's some, particularly within the military or the IC enclave. but there isn't in the broad federal, throughout the federal government, and we need to drive to that. And the reason it didn't happen over the last 10 years isn't like disrespect. It was difficulty plus, resources. So we got to figure out what those are and then make the proper investments.
Thanks. I just want to ask one rapid question. We're near the end of our time here. Thinking about ways that we in industry can get better results. So I know you spend a lot of your time looking at what government needs to do to improve results, but kind of shifting that around as you're watching what those of us in industry, particularly the defense industrial base, as you're watching how we're reacting to policies and government actions and how we're reacting to threats that are facing us. What's kind of one action you would suggest to industry to get better results in terms of deterring cyber threats? Kind of number one thing.
Yeah, I'm going to cheat and do two, and I'll say one from the process leg of the stool, and one from the people leg. The process leg is automated threat hunting and anomalous activity detection on your systems. It's where we're headed, and it's expensive. I don't want to describe everything else as a static defense. That's not fair. But that kind of like the firewall and pure endpoint detection aren't enough. You need to be inside your system, and if you can't do it, you need a third party doing it. There is a third party in there probably, but that's probably an APT, from somewhere. And then secondly, on the people side, it's that business cyber hygiene training for your people. So this isn't the password issue, although that's important. This is how are you setting up your systems? How are your people operating on your systems? And this isn't just everybody with an administrator login. It's those people particularly, but then the ones who can influence that decision making. They've got to be trained properly to make the right decisions. And to me, if you do those two things, one of which is expensive and one of which is cheap, you're going to have a significant positive impact on the cybersecurity of your platform.
Good takeaway, Mark. Thank you very much. This was really good insights. Much appreciated. Appreciate your time. Wade Forbes, who's been drawing our conversation here, will share with the audience. And thank you to the audience for your participation today. I do want to mention a couple of future events we have coming up. Our next session of the CMMC Town Hall will be next Wednesday, April 21 at 1 p.m. our usual time. We're going to have Amy Howland, she's CISO from Perspecta. On April 27th, coming up, we have our second Industry Readiness Summit Part 2. There's going to be a session, a keynote by Suzanne Spalding. Mark Montgomery is going to be joining us for that event. So thank you very much. On April 28th, we're going to have on this town hall series, we're going to have Tony Bai, who's the federal practice lead from pending C3PAO Align. And then we're going to take a break in our town hall series the first week of May and resume on May 12th with a legal perspective from Bob Metzger. So calendar's pretty full. If you haven't seen registration invitations for those events, please visit our website, neosystemscorp.com, for all the details. Thanks, everyone, and have a good day.